Hello, amazing learners. Welcome to our biology class this week. This week, which is the second week of our lesson on the nervous system, we'll be looking at the topic, the neurons and types of nervous actions. Our learning objectives. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to 1. To describe the nervous system. 2. To describe the three types of neuron. 3. To distinguish between the three types of neuron. 4. To describe the four types of nervous actions. 5. To state the differences between the reflex actions and voluntary actions. 6. To describe conditioned reflexes. And let me emphasize that this lesson will not be exhaustive, which means that it won't give you all the information that you need on this topic. Therefore, you should study and develop yourself in a world of self-discovery. Now let's dip into the lesson of the day. What is a neuron? A neuron is the basic unit of the nervous system. We can say that neurons are specialized cells that transmit impulses. They transmit impulses around the body in form of electrical charges. Now, when we talk about impulses, we are talking about messages, impulses or messages. So these messages, the neurons are responsible for transmitting them, and they transmit them in form of electrical charges. Now, a typical neuron is divided into three. We have the cell body, we have the dendrite, and we have the axon. We have the axon here. Now, if we look at the cell body is made up of the nucleus and nucleus, that is made up of RNA, and this RNA, which means that the nucleus produces a lot of proteins. It manufactures a lot of proteins. And we have the dendrite that emanates from the granulated cytoplasm of the cell body. It comes from the periphery of the cytoplasm. The dendrite is just like a fiber, or hair-like structures. It's like a hair-like structure that originates from the cytoplasm. The major function of the dendrite, because the dendrite is always in close contact with other neurons or the stimulus receptor cells. They are always in close contact with other neurons or stimulus receptor cells. So the major function of the dendrite is always to conduct impulses from the messengers from the stimulus receptors or the receptor cells. It conducts messages or conduct impulses to the cell body. So impulses will always move in this direction into the cell body. While we have the axon conducts impulses away from the cell body. It conducts impulses away from the cell body. Now this axon itself, which is the third part of the neuron, it is being coated with a structure that we call the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath has little constrictions. It has little constrictions. The little constriction that we call the ranvier. We call this the ranvier nodes. So these little constrictions that are found at the axon, that we call the ranvier nodes, reduce or regulate the movement. It brings about interruption of the movement of these impulses along the axon fibers. Now, we have how many types of neuron? What are the different types of neuron that we have, or classification of neuron? We have the motor neuron, we have relay neuron, and we have the sensory neuron. And when we talk about the motor neuron are neurons which conduct or transmit impulses from the CNS to the muscles or effector organs. So they conduct impulses, they conduct messages from the central nervous system to the effector. So this is about the motor neuron. That's why we call them the motor neuron. Now, when we talk about the relay neuron are neurons that link this the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. They link the sensory neuron and motor neuron via what we call synapses. Now, synapses is just a point or junction between two adjacent neurons, between the axon ending of one and the dendrite of the other. So the point where these two neurons meet is what we call the synapse. Now, if we come to the sensory neuron is the type of neuron that carries impulses from the receptor or sense organ to the CNS. It carries impulses from the sense organ to the central nervous system. Remember, when we talk about the central nervous system, we are looking at either the spinal cord or the brain. These are the two components of the central nervous system. So if the sensory neuron always have two major fibers. These two fibers help to conduct impulses with the help of the dendron, these dendrites, with the help of the dendrites, and it also have a dendron. So they help to conduct impulses from the receptor in the sense organ to the cell body within a short time, because they have a very short axon. They don't have a so long stand of axon. The distance between the axon, between the cell body and the dendrite is so close. So with this, it helps to conduct impulses fast to the central nervous system. Now, what are the processes of impulse transmission? When we talk about processes of impulse transmission, we have three major processes, which is the resting potential, we have the action potential, and we have the repolarization. And let me emphasize that impulses are transmitted along the neuron by electrochemical means. That implies that both electrical and chemical transmission are involved during impulse transmission. Now, if we talk about the electrical transmission, the outside body of the neuron, the outside body of the cell is always negatively charged when there is no impulse. When the neuron is not transmitting any impulse, it has a positive charge outside and a negative charge inside. Immediately this situation is observed, we say that it is the resting condition or the resting potential. There is complete polarization in which the two charges are equal. The charge of the outside environment and that of the inside environment, they are equal. So when an impulse passes through a particular point of the neuron, the polarity changes, in which the part of the inside will move towards this outside, part of this will move towards the outside, bringing about what we call the action potential. So this change in the outer surface and the inner surface brings about what we call the action potential, passage of impulses. So whenever we have excess flow of these charges, or when there is a reverse in this condition, restoring back to this first position, restoring back to what we have here, it is what we call repolarization, breaking back the initial state of the polarization. That is what we call the repolarization, making sure that this state is being reversed. So these are the electrical parts of it that are involved in transmission of impulses. When we talk about the chemical part of it, remember I said that impulse transmission it moves along in an electrochemical way. Although that these two things they move together at the same time, the chemical state brings about the electrical state. So what happens when the neuron is at rest. What happens? There are two major ions that are involved. We have the at the outer part here we have sodium ions, while here we have potassium ion. Now these potassium ions that we have here, we have potassium ions here, we have sodium ions here. Now during the resting state, the concentration of these two ions, they are even. It makes the cell membrane inside, and the concentration of the sodium ion made the cell membrane outside to be positively charged, while the concentration of the potassium ion make the cell membrane inside to be negatively charged. So these ions, when an impulse is being transmitted along a neuron, what happens? The impulse makes this membrane that we see here, this membrane, to be permeable. The permeability of this membrane will bring about this one moving through this way. While this one will move to, there will be change of ions, whereby sodium ions will move towards the inner part of the cell, while potassium ions will move towards the outer part of the cell. So this brings about what we call the action potential. So when this happens, the inside cell membrane will be positive, while the outside will be negative. So a sodium potassium pump that is located in the cell membrane brings about repolarization, whereby this sodium potassium pump, when we have excess pump of sodium here and we have excess pump of potassium here, the sodium potassium pump will regulate these ions, thereby bringing about repolarization, making sure that the motor and end plate of each of these synapses will be extended when they are close to the effector organ. So the potassium ions in the cell membrane thereby are being restored by the help of the sodium potassium pump. So it helps to regulate the level and concentration of this, thereby restoring this state. Now we have types of nervous actions. First one, we have the reflex or involuntary action, and we have the voluntary action. When we talk about the reflex action, we are looking at actions that is rapid, actions that are automatic. We say that they are automatic. They happen without the attention of the will, without consideration of the brain. The brain is not responsible for coordination of this. Instead, the nerves and the spinal cord are involved in regulation of the involuntary actions. These actions, they respond to the stimulus by an organ or receptor. It occurs without prior thought or planning. So it is being coordinated by the spinal cord. Example of such actions includes blinking of the eye, beating of the heart, withdrawal of hand from a hot object when you touch it. So these things happen without prior knowledge or prior planning. So they happen, and the brain is not always involved in this. When we talk about voluntary action, these are what we call action of the will. We plan about them. The brain initiates these actions. They are being controlled by the brain. So we think about them before we indulge into them. This includes you as an individual selecting a particular fruit from a basket of many fruits. So an individual going into a boutique and making a selection of one type of cloth out of many clothes that you see there. So in this type of action, the brain is involved. Why here? The spinal cord is involved the spinal cord is involved in the reflex action. So you will see that spinal cord in the reflex action, while the brain in the voluntary action. Now, in reflex action, let me go back to the reflex action. In the reflex action, there is what we call a reflex arc. A reflex arc is the pathway in which reflex action passes through. Is the path through which impulses passes in a reflex action. So in a reflex action, that path in which messages or impulses passes through is what we call a reflex arc. So here now we have a receptor organ, which is the skin. But venture that this individual touch a hot iron, the receptor organ, which is the skin, will to collect this, and the sensory neuron picks this information from the receptor organ. This line and passes it to the relay neuron. The relay neuron is located in the spinal cord. So it is the neuron that brings or joins these two together. It links the sensory neuron and the motor neuron together. So when the CNS must have given back impulse, the relay neuron will put it towards this area. It will pass towards the motor neuron, whereby the motor neuron, which is will cause the effector muscle. The effector, for example, the muscle, when you touch a hot iron, the effector will bring about contraction of the biceps. The contraction of bicep will bring about you drawing your hand backward. So this pathway in which impulses passes through is what we call the reflex arc. So that is what we call the reflex arc. We have what we call condition reflex. What is a condition reflex? A condition reflex are reflexes that occurs in behavioral pattern. These things, they are acquired only through learning. Once you master them, you can always perform almost all of them without thinking or much concentration. For example, when dancing, if you have the skill to dance, you can do it so nice without thinking about it. It comes within you. One driving is another example of a condition reflex. One driving a car, one swimming, one walking, riding a bicycle. These are what we call condition reflex. This thing we call condition reflex was developed by a neuroscientist that we call Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov is the person that developed what we call condition reflex. Ivan Pavlov is the one that developed this. He used a dog to investigate what this condition reflex as a result of salivating of a dog. So he developed this behavioral pattern that whenever a dog is salivating, that means that there is food close. So it will maybe ringing of a bell will bring about presentation of food. As student, you know that whenever you hear a particular type of bell, you know that there is something waiting for you. So these things are behavioral pattern, things that you learn, and whenever you hear about them, you know that it is passing a particular information. These are the type of reflexes that are behavioral. We acquire these knowledges through learning, and when we master them, we can't forget them easily. So we do them with ease. We'll end our lesson this week here, hoping by next week we emerge into a more life of self-discovered student. Till then, thank you.